For 1977, Cadillac and General Motors downsized its entire lineup as consumers looked for more fuel-efficient vehicles and ones that actually were more maneuverable by this point. Cadillacs had become so big in some cases that they would barely fit in customers' garages, most garages at the time being about 20 feet in overall length. And the 1976 Cadillac Fleetwood Brougham, for instance, was 234 inches in overall length, just 6 inches shy of being 20 feet long. So you better pull all the way up and have nothing in front of your car in order to be able to close your garage door. Needless to say, the combination of the OPEC oil embargo of 1973, coupled with the fact that, as I mentioned, some people just perceived Cadillacs to be getting too big, really drove downsizing for 1977, and Cadillac and all of the GM divisions made their cars smaller for that model year. When it came to the Fleetwood Brougham, the car went from 133-inch wheelbase to 121.5-inch wheelbase, shedding almost 1 foot between the wheels. And while that doesn't sound like a 121.5-inch wheelbase is very short, it certainly is compared to 133. And then on top of the wheelbase reduction, the 234 inches in overall length became about 221 inches in overall length. So over a foot was carved off of the length. Now, the interesting thing about this downsizing was that while the physical size of the car was smaller on the outside, really not much was changed when it came to interior roominess. The overall headroom, the hip room, and the leg room inside the cars was about the same as the previous generation models. The only thing that was really different was the shoulder room, because the old cars had so much tumble home that the seats couldn't actually be as wide as the car because the car body was so curved. Now that was not nearly as true, but you still had a ton of room on the inside. And really, one of the things that I don't admittedly understand in the collector car market is I think the 1977 to 1979 Fleetwoods that are the subject of this video are some, I should say, Fleetwood Broughams, and even the Devilles, whatever element of the Cadillac lineup, except for the Seville and the Eldorado, are kind of unloved cars from a collector car standpoint. They're still very cheap to buy, and amazingly, the 77 to 79 Cadillacs are cheaper seemingly to buy than, as an example, a 1986, 87, 88, 89, 90, etc. Fleetwood Brougham, which has a much smaller engine, the Olds 307 V8 more often than not, versus the Cadillac 425 cubic inch under hood in these 77 to 79 cars. And the latter is just a far better engine. You get the 425 Cadillac V8, a turbo hydromatic 400 transmission as opposed to a 204R transmission on the later ones. So it's faster, it's quieter. Well, I shouldn't say quieter. The Olds 307 is pretty quiet. But I still think that these are more substantial, the 77 to 79 models, than the later years of this particular variant. Alas, you might as well exploit that if you're looking for an entry-level classic car that you're going to love driving. One of these is just sublime. That being said, what we're going to talk about today is the surprise inspiration for the 77 Fleetwood Brougham. Now, one of the things that people don't know is that the 77 to 79 Fleetwood Brougham actually had a different B-pillar structure and look than the Deville series. That was not true once the car underwent a redesign for the 1980 model year, as you can see here. In 1980, the C-pillar was made more vertical, and the roofline and the B-pillar, the A, B, C-pillar structures were all common across the Deville and the Fleetwood Brougham. That was not true with the introductory model that came out in 1977 and ran through 1979. Now, why did that design change? Well, remember during this time frame, after GM downsized the Cadillacs for 1977, Lincoln continued on with this huge full-size town car through 1979. And there were some Cadillac buyers who actually complained that the Cadillac just looked smaller than the Lincoln. And so the C-pillar was made more vertical for 1980 to make the quarter panel look longer and the car look longer overall. I think it was a handsome redesign, but I still like the 1977 to 1979 variant. In any case, take a look at the side profile here of the 1977 Deville, and you'll see the B-pillar is just kind of a regular vertical style B-pillar. Now, if we contrast that with this 1977 to 79 Fleetwood, you notice that the B-pillar kind of has a triangular shape. It's kind of kinked in the middle. And, well, where in the world did that inspiration for that come from, and why did Cadillac try to do that? By the way, I believe that these cars did share roof panels. So designers were trying to get, I think, a visual cue in the side view that would denote a difference between the Deville and the Fleetwood. Bear in mind that the cars otherwise shared a lot of sheet metal, the hoods, the fenders, the quarters, etc. So this might have been seemingly a somewhat cost-effective way to get a little bit of a visual differentiation. And I believe the only difference really between the Fleetwood Brougham and the Deville was the rear door upper section was different. I think the front door upper between the cars is the same. You notice that it appears, if you look back at the photos that I showed, that the angle of the door upper on the Fleetwood and the Deville is identical. I think the kink and that triangular shaped B-pillar really just affects the rear doors and the upper portion of the rear doors. The door lowers are the same. So same roof panel, same front door upper. The only thing that was different and which was required here was the door upper and consequently the glass for the rear door. But same window regulator and same door internals, I would say, as well. Now, what was the inspiration for that particular kind of design? Well, the Duesenberg so-called 20 grand car that was the subject of some of our previous videos, I believe was the inspiration for that. And take a look at this beautiful Duesenberg 20 grand, so-called because its base price was $20,000 in the height of the Great Depression, about $500,000 today in today's dollars. So imagine driving around this car at the height of the Great Depression. I mean, you were extremely wealthy. But it's got that beautiful, and here I have to say symmetric and kinked B-pillar, that triangular shape. It looks, I think, much better than the 77 to 79 Fleetwood triangular B-pillar. But my sense is that, as I was mentioning before, the bean counters at GM couldn't give the designers everything that they wanted. And so the designers made a bit of a sacrifice and only changed the rear door upper to form a similar kinked B-pillar. Now, how do I know that that is potentially the inspiration for this Cadillac? Well, I don't know necessarily definitively, but what I can say is that some of the artwork for the 1977 Fleetwood demonstrates this particular form, and it has that symmetric kind of kinked B-pillar or the triangular shaped B-pillar of the Duesenberg 20 grand. And I think that was what designers originally had intended that then got cost cut, let's say, into the final variant. And here is some of the design artwork for the 1977 Cadillacs. This is for a Coupe de Ville. You can kind of see it by the badging behind the front wheel. But notice you have the straight B-pillar. This is, of course, is a two-door, not a four-door. But it's just a fantastic looking sketch. Still have the vertical style tail lamps, but kind of a concave sweep to them, along with the deck lid. You do have a skirted rear wheel. Interestingly, the 77 to 79 Cadillacs, whether you got the Fleetwood, the Deville, didn't matter. There was no fender skirt. The wheel was kind of skirted in that the opening was lower on the rear wheel, but there was no fender skirt, and Cadillac would reintroduce fender skirts on subsequent designs. Even the front-wheel drive Fleetwood would have fender skirts for a little bit, but not on this particular variant. Regardless, I think this is a very dynamic sketch, and you can see the lower is quite, I'll say, small and rather athletic, and you have this big upper on the car. In fact, the final cars would have almost the opposite proportions, small uppers and big lowers, which made them look a bit more substantial. So some elements of the design kind of made it through to production and others didn't. And I do love the way that the C-pillar flows into the quarter panel and forms this crease that kind of bisects, I guess you call it like a spear line on the body side. Pretty sweet, and just a great sketch by John Gable, who, by the way, now I believe is a fine artist. He left the auto industry relatively early in his career to become a fine artist, and you can see why, given the quality of his sketches. Here, by the way, is a full-size model of another proposal for the 1977 Cadillacs. Again, a Deville. Notice the straight up and down B-pillar. And then you have a little bit of what John Gable was conveying in that sketch in terms of the taillights and the slant to them in the deck lid. It's not really the concave slant. This looks a little bit more like an Oldsmobile 98 from the rear, but still, again, a handsome proposal. Also, take a look at how low the belt line is on this car, and that provides huge glass area. I suspect the designers were trying to make these cars just feel very roomy, given they were smaller. So increasing the glass area is one way to make sure that the passengers and the driver inside can have this feeling of roominess. And take a look at the belt line relative to the backlight. The backlight is relatively small, and in comparison to the belt line, which is very low on this car. And then you have this other sketch that shows the triangular B-pillar that I was mentioning before, very similar to the Duesenberg 20 Grand, even to the point that this appears to be sketched with a cloth top or some sort of covering over it. And that was something the designers rarely did, was sketch cars with anything other than a painted top. So you can really see the inspiration here. Again, you have the skirted rear wheel that you didn't have in the production model. You have that diving kind of line down the side. That would not make its way to the 1980 Bustleback Seville, by the way. But in any case, it's hard to argue that Duesenberg really inspired the 1977 Cadillac Fleetwood Brougham and that specific upper. So in summary, if you're able to find one of the 77 to 79 Cadillacs, I definitely recommend buying it. This example that I'm showing right here, this dark green one, actually sold on Bring a Trailer. Had about 55,000 miles, and it sold for $8,000. And it was in pretty gosh darn good shape. I mean, not a perfect car by any stretch of the imagination, but definitely one that you could use to take to car shows and just enjoy. Take a look at the interior here. You certainly got comfy interiors, and they're very quiet cars, very smooth riding vehicles. The 425 is really an excellent Cadillac engine. Not quite as powerful as the 500, but really not that bad. More specifically, made 180 horsepower, and then the torque, which was really important, was 320 pound-feet. With the carbureted variant for some model years, you get the fuel-injected engine that made 195 horsepower. But it's a lot more torque than the Olds 307, which typically had around 250 pound-feet of torque or so. And like I said, you get the bulletproof turbo-hydromatic 3-speed as opposed to 200 4R. And one last little quirk and trivia about these Cadillacs. Take a look at the underside. You can see here the belly of the car and the transmission, the turbo-hydromatic 400. I always thought this was interesting because they have the catalytic converter on the passenger side. Notice the driver's side has a brace there that goes from the perimeter frame to the cross member. But there's no brace that goes to the passenger side because obviously it would interfere with the catalytic converter. So I guess only the driver's side got a brace. The driver's side is a little bit more stiff, perhaps, than the passenger side. Regardless, great cars overall. Put a comment in the comment section and let me know what you think or thoughts on this vehicle. Thanks again for watching.